Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 31st of July and today's the final day within one of the most eventful months in recent history, whether it be within the US domestically or just externally looking at the entire world. In Venezuela, a lot of drama over the past week. In the Middle East, a lot of tensions flaring up. And honestly, if you guys have enough of an interest in either one of these topics, then I'm totally interested in making videos about them. But it really is up to the viewers because I know that most of you guys are here to watch the updates, especially around Chasiv Yar, which is where we're going to begin today, because the Russian forces have now definitely been able to infiltrate past the canal, infiltrate into Ukrainian defensive positions that were built up over a year ago. And the hope by the Ukrainians is that this would have been an impenetrable defense line that could have held for a very, very long time and protected the flanks of Chasiv Yar. And now the opposite is happening. Russian DRGs within a month have been able to undermine this defense line and are beginning to infiltrate directly into the residential areas of the city that are only about 1.5 kilometers away from the heartland of the city itself. And so this is very concerning developments. We have to first look at the confirmed advances based on geolocations, and then we'll mention some of the unconfirmed reports from both sides coming from Telegram, which I have not marked yet with a yellow color, but I am basically showing this larger gray zone in between the Russian and Ukrainian lines because there is a lot of ambiguity surrounding the control status in those regions. And so we all know that the Russian forces over the past month, as I've been reporting, have steadily increased the amount of DRG operators within this forested region in between Kalinivka and the Canal district. By now, it has become very solid Russian controlled territory, and they felt comfortable and paved the way for vehicles to actually begin crossing over the canal and dismounting troops, whether it be in tree lines or in trenches built by the Ukrainians. And they did this in small quantities, so you're not seeing massive columns advancing through. That would simply be unwise when you have such massive coverage with drones in this region on the Ukrainian side. But yeah, every now and then you do have these operations where it's a BMP or some smaller, more mobile vehicle making it all the way to the physical crossings of the canal and then dismounting a squad. And this has been going on now for about a week or maybe even more. And we have the geolocated data to prove this. And it shows that the Russian forces have been able to advance and take over some of these defenses. And so here you see there's this sort of strip of land where the pipelines run through. It's about 700 meters. And you could see that it's a region where there is no depression. There's no actual water in these regions. It's just pipelines. And I believe they're actually empty at this point. The canal itself is basically drained. So on the map and Google Maps satellite imagery, you see that it's all blue here because, yeah, there was a lot of water that was filled up. And at this point, there's basically none here. And so the real issue with crossing over this canal has more to do with the fact that it's an exposed position in the open that in theory could be overlooked by the Ukrainian side if they were to have troops on hills, and then they would have an amazing line of sight. But at this point, the situation has changed. And so we know that the Russian forces earlier this week were able to advance about 200 meters westwards and begin their first DRG activities in the region west of the canal, which means that they've already begun to infiltrate into the schools in the various residential areas located just west of Kalinivka. This is so important because it means that the Russians are trying to degrade one of the vectors north of Chasiv Yar. And the region that I'm marking with this red square is not really the issue. It has more so to do with the region just to the west. This area is home to an abundance of slag heaps, quarries, whatever it may be. The common denominator is that it's on really high elevation, which puts it basically on par with whatever Ukrainian positions are located within the heart of Chasiv Yar. And don't get me wrong, those positions are really well protected from a sort of structural standpoint because you have apartments that are just overlooking everything and also factories that are really high. And all of them are also on the center of a ridge that is on massive elevation. And so the Russians really do need to have in their immediate vicinity west of the canal a sort of option that sort of levels the playing field. And one region where they could achieve that is through this western vector crossing the canal past Kalinivka. So keep an eye out for that and for the ways that it could affect the future defense line that the Ukrainians have built for the post-Chasiv Yar days. And I don't want to get too deep into this because the Battle of Chasiv Yar is only now beginning. But the Ukrainians have already prepared for the scenario wherein they lose the city. And their hope is to try to build a new defense line from Markove and then all the way just to this basically eastern outskirts of Konstantinivka, trying to connect it all together now, and hopefully their hope is that they could build most of it on ridges that would at the very least be on level playing field with some of the heights that the Russians would be able to take around Chasiv Yar. And so keep an eye out for the sort of construction that the Ukrainians put up in this region, because following the fall of Chasiv Yar, there's going to be a massive amount of territory, a large swaths of fields in between the next populated regions, the next cities. And Russia will have an opportunity to exploit that sort of gap in the line and reach all the way to the next Ukrainian defensive positions. But now let's look at the current defensive positions that the Russians are overrunning. And so we could see that marked here in yellow, the Russians taking over this small strip of land that includes areas of the former canal and also the pipelines. And so it's an advance of about 300 meters southwards, nearly reaching actually the houses in this region. And we have a video here from, I believe it is the 30th of July, from the Rorog unit, which is a drone element of the 24th Mechanized Brigade, one of the main Ukrainian units that has been moved in over the past month to defend in this region. They hit a Russian BMD-4 across the canal. And in that video, you could see, of course, all the water is drained. You could see that this region is largely abandoned by the Ukrainians, and that vehicles are able to make it out in the open and then dismount troops in the trenches here that are marked in yellow. And that's what's happened, essentially. This is also verified based on the video from July 31st, which shows various FPV strikes on Russian positions basically just west of the canal. And so in this case, it shows that there were infantry dismounted from vehicles that came across from this bridge over here, which is actually still standing. I haven't seen any attempts to destroy it. And now cars are coming through here, vehicles, and actually releasing troops in this region over here, which is basically the ground zero of the Ukrainian defense line, an area where you'd expect to see a massive concentration of Ukrainian defenses, or at the very least, significant counterattacks once the Russians reach that area. And there may be counterattacks going on per Ukrainian reporting from the 46th Air Assault Brigade. They did claim that the Russians infiltrated into the residential areas and that there is currently back and forth attacks occurring with the Ukrainians trying to, of course, level the front line. But yeah, it really is a big concern for the Ukrainians that after spending over a year building this defense just west of the canal in an area where they do have really good elevation on their side, they have hills. Of course, it's not a massive domination over the Russians in certain areas like in the Canal district, but it does overlook, for instance, the forested region and some of the crossings towards the other side of the canal. And that's not been enough. And all the reinforcements that were moved in, that's not been enough. The concentration of troops that should be right now defending the eastern perimeter of the city, that's not been enough because the Russians have been able to directly enter and push back the Ukrainians without even having to conduct flanking operations to do so. And so for zooming in, there are currently rumors that go past the position that I marked as under Russian control, which we know for sure. And that includes a rather large amount of territory in terms of width. At its maximum extent, it's about 700 meters in width. And then if we look at this, it's spanning an area of about 1.3 kilometers from the southern tip, where you do have some Ukrainian trenches, and the area where we filmed, or we saw the Russians getting filmed. And so, yeah, this is a significant piece of territory that is currently, it's really ambiguous, its status, because Russian sources, at least on Telegram, are claiming that this entire gray zone region is currently under Russian control, either DRGs or from the 98th Air Assault Division, VDV elements that have actually been able to storm and turn these into permanent positions for the Russians, which would be a really rapid pace when you think about it, because if you compare this to the fighting in the Bakhmut suburbs, for instance, there was really dragged out fighting in some of those most eastern positions. And in the same sort of way, you could say that there was also really extensive fighting for the Canal district. And a lot of that has to do with how disconnected it is from the other Russian nodes of attack that are located kilometers eastwards around the Bakhmut region. But here, the situation is different. Here, the Russians do have the Canal district at their disposal in terms of elevation, but also as sort of a coordination hub. And it is immediately next to the Ukrainian positions. And so the Russians do have much more of an advantage when they're going on the attack here. And it appears that it's actually reached the level where they're able to just directly attack towards the Ukrainian defense line in an area that should be the most fortified, and actually are able to make and create gaps. And so I can't verify the reports that the Russians have been able to actually get full control over the regions that I'm shading in red, but keep an eye out for what's occurring over here, because these are residential areas that are, if we're measuring it, only about 1.5 kilometers away from the central part of the city. And so it's really becoming now illuminating for the defenders here, where they realize that they're actually the urban battle has actually started already, and the Russian forces are already beginning to make gains, and a lot of those gains could be protected by the fact that this defense line is already being undermined by the Russian side, because based on the Russian side reporting, a lot of these trenches marked in yellow would already be under Russian control, and it would happen in the span of about a month, with the operations really beginning to uptake over the past week. We need to assume that these defenses that were built on a favorable geography would be able to stand the test of time for a much longer period, if you compare it to battles like Bakhmut, where there weren't really any prepared trenches, and the Ukrainians were actually at a disadvantage when it came to elevation, located in the middle of a river valley. But just due to the sheer ferocity, tenacity of their defense, and due to the sheer amount of reinforcements that were moved in, they were able to drag out the fighting in some of the suburbs for months upon months. And so we're going to have to wait and see how that develops within the eastern part of Chasiv Yar, especially with what's going on the northern flank. Now, moving on, we do have a really important geolocation from the suburb of Zalizhny, where the Russian forces have in recent days made really significant strides and are basically in control of what I'd say is maybe 90% of the suburb itself. They've also been able to make really significant gains into Pivnishnya further north, getting control over this entire forested region, getting control over the apartment complex that gives the Russians a really important vantage point, because these apartments are not destroyed. So you're going to see Russian recon drone operators, snipers, ATGM crews, whatever it may be, reach this region and then begin firing towards the Ukrainians located westwards along what was supposed to be their impromptu line of defense, which is currently being poked and basically broken through in several axes. Most notably, if we're looking further south here, the Russian forces have been able to get this sort of strip of land under their control. It amounts to an advance of about 400 meters in the northwestern direction. What happened is the Russian forces, they were able to secure the perimeter of Zalizhny in the southwestern corner, and now have actually commenced an operation to cross past the diagonal road over here that divides Zalizhny and sort of the eastern outskirts of Toretsk itself. And the region where the Russians decided to make this advance, where they decided to push through, is extremely close to the slag heap over here, which is Ukraine's highest elevated region that is immediately next to the front line. And currently the Russians are making this move to try to flank it from the east, trying to cut off access that the Ukrainians have to moving in more forces there, trying to take over some of the houses that are located past the horizontal road or diagonal road. And so that is really important. It shows the Russians are serious about eliminating this one final sort of localized threat, and them losing that, the Ukrainians, I mean, losing this area after they sent in a significant amount of reinforcements and perhaps actually do outnumber the Russian forces as the urban battle continues. And despite the fact that the Russians being able to advance and take over one of the key nodes within not that long of a period of time, I mean, the fighting in Zalizhny has only been occurring for about 3 weeks, maybe even less. And more broadly, the fighting in this part of the front line has really only intensified about a month and a week ago. And so it's like been 40 days since the Russians started this operation, and they have already been able to breach into the suburbs over here. And getting control over a slag heap like this would give the Russians a lot of local domination into some of the supply lines that are leading towards the line of contact from Toretsk into the battlefield itself, a couple of kilometers eastwards, towards the forested regions nearby where the Ukrainians may be trying to conceal themselves as they defend, and towards some of the final dachas that are located on the eastern approaches to the city itself, which also, I remind you, is largely located on lower elevation because of the sort of river valley that passes through in this region. But in all fairness to the Ukrainians and Toretsk, there are still a lot of slag heaps within the center of the city that are on really massive elevated sort of plateaus, and those give the Ukrainians at least a certain amount of support. And so before we move on, let's just look at the geolocation quickly. This came from the 100th Mechanized Brigade, which we know is moved from the Novo-Alexandrivka region and generally the sort of Pokrovsk defensive theater. And now its Voron unit has released this video of FPV strikes onto houses and also a trench that is west of the temporary defense line. And so, yes, the Ukrainians actually did build some defenses here, including static ones in the ground, with the hope that it would just prolong the fighting and sort of stabilize around this line. But no, the Russian forces have been able to, this past week, just completely push through the suburbs, trying to actually being able to evade Ukraine's strategy of sort of grinding them down, and have now been able to just push through and take over a lot of those defenses. And so we're going to move further south now and look just very briefly at the situation that is developing around Orikhiv and Robotyne. So here we have this geolocation which came out on the 30th of July. So I should have talked about it yesterday, actually. This is the 20th Battalion of the Separate Presidential Brigade. Really important Ukrainian unit in terms of its combat experience. The issue I have with this unit, and I have with so many other units, is how the battalions are split up. And of course, the brigade commander doesn't have say in that at all. It's coming from the higher command, the ones that are actually deciding where units should be placed and then shuffling them around. And so they could really only do the best given the situation, but it is difficult as the head of a brigade and for the entire brigade headquarters to stay united and coordinated if you have 1/4 of the unit located around the Velyka and Vasilka axis, the other quarter located, northwards in Luhansk, the other quarter in Bakhmut, etc., etc. And so here you have at least one of the battalions that is involved in the defensive efforts following the Russian capture of Orikhiv. The Russian goal here is to fully secure the eastern flank of the village, and what that means is getting control over this hill over here that I've marked in X. Certain portions of it have already been captured by the Russians, but a lot of it is still located in this sort of open field gray zone where the Russians would have a very difficult time stepping foot in right now because of the work of drone crews in the region. But getting control over this hill would give the Russians an immediate domination over the next Ukrainian villages in the region, whether it be Blaudatne, Sorozhove, Makarivka, and then looking all the way northwards to the main sort of nexus, Velyka, Novosilka. And so here you could see the video where the 20th Battalion just strikes Russian infantry located in this area west of Orikhiv, trying to sort of creep their way, or east of Orikhiv, creeping their way northwards through trenches, through tree lines, and actually utilizing cluster munition shelling as well, because the Ukrainians are making a lot of use of that in this part of the front line. And more generally, in the southern Donbass region, we're seeing a lot of that, especially from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which is not here, but previously was operating here. And so let's just look a bit further westwards and see some of the situation unfolding northwest of Robotyne. I've not discussed it in detail, and I really should have, but now we have the opportunity because the Russian forces over the past few days have been able to capture nearly 4 square kilometers of territory. If we're looking at the extent of the advance, at its most extreme, it amounts to something like 1.6 kilometers. So that is important, and it does show that the Russians are trying to sort of fill any gaps here. What I mean by that is they're trying to solidify control over the northwestern flank of the village, and in doing so, taking control over some of these sort of fields and tree lines that are very close to the Russian Surovikin line, or not even the Surovikin line, but just trenches that were built near the front line. Surovikin line, if you recall, is located several kilometers south. And so now the Russians are just giving their positions here a bit more of a buffer. You could see that based on the actions of the 65th Mechanized Brigade, where they are targeting Russian forces closer and closer to the actual highway. This highway is so important because if you look northwards, it actually just leads to suburbs south of Orikhiv. And getting control over this highway would give the Russians at least one of several major sort of axes through which to begin the flanking operation and degradation of the Ukrainian defensive component in Orikhiv, which is definitely not Russia's main priority right now, but just something to keep in mind for the future to shape the battlefield in a way that is not conducive for the Ukrainian defense. But in any case, let's look at what the Ukrainians did. 65th Brigade, their FPV struck a Russian soldier on the highway to Orikhiv. That's July 27th. And then on July 31st, 2 Russian soldiers that were sort of like advancing along this tree line over here, they were spotted and then hit by the 65th Brigade FPV. So clearly this unit does still have the main responsibility in this region, even after, I don't know if it's been a year, but maybe you could say like 7 months, 8 months of being really at the forefront of defending the Ukrainian positions in this region. So they've now really been given the sort of rest that they need after all that time. Now we're going to move on to reporting from Bloomberg, which is being corroborated by, all the Western mainstream media. They're now claiming that the Ukrainians have received the first F-16 aircraft. Now, the actual number has not been specified, but everybody's saying that it is a rather small quantity. And in terms of trying to quantify that, what's also being reported in tandem is that the Ukrainians will not receive more than one squadron by the end of 2024, which would be around 20 aircraft. So by the end of this year, we're now in July, which is a bit more than halfway through this year. And so by the end of this year, the Ukrainians may receive at most 20 of these aircraft. And so you can imagine that it is significantly less at the current moment, because it's going to be sort of a gradual process of the Ukrainians receiving the F-16s. And then there's going to be a lot of logistics involved in moving it from the border regions, wherever they may be, trying to coordinate the movement deeper into Ukraine, into various airstrips. And it does have to be in airstrips that are closer to the front line in order to actually engage with some of the combat in those regions. And there has to be all the infrastructure in place, the hangars, the camouflage, because here's an issue that I'm going to be pointing out from the get-go. The Ukrainians themselves said that they cannot build concrete hangars for these aircraft. And so even if they're camouflaged, once they're targeted, they're going to be at a really compromised situation if they're going to be targeted by any sort of array of Russian missiles. And just keep in mind that over the past few months, the Russian forces have been testing out their S-400 systems, launching a lot of them just randomly into central Ukraine, coming from areas of Crimea. And the entire goal of that, it now appears, has just been to see if they have the capability to try to actually succeed in hitting an F-16. And so now I think the Russians will try that in actuality to try to intercept some of these F-16s. And so there's going to have to be a lot of caution exercised initially, especially with these jets, because they're not going to receive a large amount up until the end of this year. And then what's been committed, at the very least, we can't say when it's going to come, but what's been committed by various EU countries that I can list, whether they be Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, or Norway, they're saying that they're going to give the Ukrainians, by the end of this, about 79 F-16s. And so if you're defining a squadron as 24, then, you could say that it's slightly more than 3 squadrons. Or if you're defining it as 20, then you could say it's generally around 4 squadrons. And in terms of the actual pilots that are going to be manning this has been a big issue with why there have been delays in the first place. Because, the Americans, they stopped being opposed in principle to the shipment of these fighter jets in May of 2023, over a year ago. And then they actually approved the process by August. So it's been basically a year by now of this entire process. And a lot of this started with a 4-month English course for the Ukrainian pilots involved within the UK. So for 4 months, that's to get, the basic engineering lexicon, all the parlance associated with operating sort of this equipment. So the same thing has to go for the engineers. They have to be highly specialized, and so they need to just be completely informed in a new system that they never operated in their entire lives, and they have to do that in a language which is foreign to them. And so, of course, that's going to take time, especially given the circumstances in Ukraine itself, which is the fact that you do need to have those highly specialized engineers and really high quality pilots operating at the front line. And so you can't afford to send too many of them at the same period in time abroad to study, while you actually need some of them to actually fight in the war itself. And so that created the circumstances for so many delays. There were also many delays because of logistics, because of issues with finding spare parts. But really, regardless, the Ukrainians do need the F-16s. And I'm going to preface that by saying that, first of all the Western media has come out in unison and are already warning that it won't be a wonder weapon. And I think this is because they've just sort of learned from experience that sort of hyping up a weapon system like they did for so many other Ukrainian sort of weapons that were moved in from the West. And this happened with, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles on the ground, and not necessarily with aircraft. And so it is a bit different in this case. But, they've become used to this at this point, and, they don't want to overhype it up. And so this time there's actually a more sober opinion in relation to the F-16s. And also you have the issue with the fact that over the past few months, the Russian forces have been really active in targeting these Ukrainian airstrips. And I'm sure a lot of that has to do with sort of creating an incentive for the Ukrainians to move their aircraft further westwards. And even then, the Russians will definitely be trying to take out the vehicles or take out the jets, take out the entirety of the airstrip, trying to make it non-operational. And so definitely those are concerns that will, if they're not attended to effectively, then it will neutralize any sort of positive effect that the F-16s can actually have, which they do have at the current moment. If we're talking about a very small quantity of F-16s, which we are, in terms of the long-term amount of squadrons that could come in, that could be years down the line, 2025, 2026, even more. And it's not really relevant to today's discussion. Right now, we're only talking about a maximum of one squadron by the end of the year, and even that could be exaggerated, so we have to wait and see. If we're talking about a very small amount of F-16s, then in terms of basically covering the 700-mile sort of line of contact, they're not going to be able to do that. So they're going to have very specific roles if needed for the front line, and that would have to be for a very short period of times and would not be able to significantly affect the course of any one of those battles. And so it's more likely that the first batch will be used more so as to help Ukraine with its air defense. And the way that's going to be done is by using the AIM-120 air-to-air missiles. They're going to be used to try to intercept various Russian drones, missiles, of course, in the air, and also try to intercept Russian aircraft to try to take them down. So who knows, maybe we'll see some more dogfights. And what's important to note is which type of AIM-120 the Ukrainians will be using with their F-16s, because there are some versions, older ones, that have very limited range, and then it doesn't have that big of an effect. Like, it's not going to be able to disincentivize the Russians from coming in with a Su-34, for instance, 60, 70 kilometers away from the front line and dropping off their FAB 1500s, which I think the Ukrainians, when they sort of started off with F-16s, or more recently they thought about it, they were hoping that the F-16s would be able to act as a deterrent to a lot of those FAB strikes and finally be the remedy to decrease the amount of FABs that are being dropped on a daily basis. Over a month, they could drop 3,000, which is just a massive amount, and they're just getting no pushback from the Ukrainians. And so this could be the first time that the Russians could be limited in the extent, but based on the small numbers and based on the type of AIM missile, it may not be possible. So if they're using the AIM-120D, then that's when it becomes interesting, because the Ukrainian spokesperson from their Air Force, I heard them saying that some of the AIM missiles that they've been provided with do have a range of between 160 to 180 kilometers. And at that point, yeah, that could have an effect depending on the quantity, because let's measure out, those could go and basically reach anywhere within the airspace of Ukraine itself and also into the airspace of major cities within Russia itself. And so that would be important in trying to detect and fire towards various Russian aircraft from a long distance. But another issue is that there's a dual use for the AIM missiles, because they're also used for the NASAMS, which is of course, the surface-to-air missiles. And so there's going to have to be a sort of split. Some of the missiles will be given to the F-16, some will be given to the NASAMS. And so then we're looking to see whether there was going to be a new sort of presidential drawdown authority where they give additional missiles, additional procurements towards the Ukrainians, so they have enough for whatever F-16s they do have. But just inherently, they're going to be limited because of the small amount of F-16s that have made it to Ukraine. And at least initially, the Ukrainians are going to be very cautious with how they use it. They're not going to want to move it too close to the front line. Syrskyi said that they may operate as close as 25 miles away from the actual border with Russia. And again, for the most part, they're really not going to be used as suppression of enemy air defense. They're not going to be used to target Russian logistical hubs or whatever that may be. That's just my opinion, and also the opinion of most of the reporters that are talking about it, just based on the scale. Of course, that could change when more come in. But yeah, in terms of significantly changing the sort of dynamics of the air war, it's really not going to be enough in its current composition, where the Ukrainians, most of their air force is made up of these old Soviet MiG-29s, Su-27s, Su-24s, and the amount they have is at least reportedly around 70. I'm not exactly sure if that's true, because I just read all of this from Western sources, but again, even if you're taking that number and comparing it to numbers that have been recognized for the Russian side of aircraft in the ballpark of 800 or 700, and if you're looking specifically at the types of aircraft the Russians are using, 100 of them are Su-35s, 100 are Su-34s. That's already 200, more than double, and those are only the most modern sort of aircraft that the Russians have besides the Su-57s, and it's already more than double the Ukrainian Air Force itself. And so adding in a few F-16s, at least initially, it's going to have an impact when it comes to sort of the air defense aspect, and then much less so when it comes to smaller or sort of the operations targeting Russian ground forces. And so really keep an eye out for the way that they end up getting utilized in the next coming months. And that's all for today. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.